Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our third-party risk management regulations to know to protect your organization webinar. My name is Abby Clark, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of that widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some of those during the webcast, but for those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials. Answer all 3 of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. Be in attendance for the entire 1-hour live session and complete the follow-up survey. We will be sending the link to that follow-up survey 24 hours after this live session. If you meet all requirements, we will send you your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. And with us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, Venminder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss interpreting regulatory requirements and identifying common regulatory themes, thinking like an auditor or regulatory examiner, self-auditing your third-party risk management program, and more. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, and links to our third-party risk management guidance and regulations ebook, our third-party risk management industry regulations library, our vendor cybersecurity and privacy compliance, key regulations and tips to know infographic, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. So with all of that being said, I would like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're talking all about regulatory requirements and agencies and what to know. We're going to start off today with a little discussion about third-party risk management and the law, and then we're going to move to understanding the components of a regulatory landscape. We'll also dive into some recent regulatory changes and some things you should know. And then we'll get to the point of how to perform a self-audit, how to think like a regulator. Of course, we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. So let's get started. We always like to start our webinars with a little reminder about how third-party risk management is so important and why it's so important. But today, we're just going to go right to this last bullet here. For many industries, third-party risk management is the law. It's required by various regulators across multiple industries. Now, of course, there are many different regulatory requirements across industries, and here are some of the industries that are known for most heavily relying on third parties to provide their products and services. So everything from consumer business to financial services, manufacturing, and technology, media, and telecom, just to name a few. And each of these industries have pretty specific and unique regulatory requirements around third-party risk management. Let's talk about the regulatory landscape. I think it's fair to say that many, many years ago when I was first starting in third-party risk management, I had this idea that rules, laws, and regulations were just kind of all interchangeable lingo. And there's probably some of you out there that think the same thing. So this is actually a great place to start this conversation with the basics. So let's start with laws. You know, if you're old enough to remember Schoolhouse Rock on Saturday morning, you will probably always think about little old Bill sitting on Capitol Hill waiting to become law. You know, it was a really fun jingle to help us remember our civics lessons, but the long and short of it is that laws must go through a legislative process. This includes sponsorship and debate and then passage through Congress. Then there are budget hearings and finally executive approval. But once that bill becomes a law, it governs everyone equally. Regulations, on the other hand, are not subject to the legislative process. Regulations are actually created by executive departments and agencies, and those agencies and departments are appointed positions. So the current administration always has a lot of influence over those regulators. That's why proposed regulations and regulatory agency appointments are often subject to a lot of political challenges. But keep in mind that these regulators typically don't make proposed regulations in the dark. As a matter of practice, they typically allow the public to see the regulation and to provide comments. Sometimes those comments are made by industry leaders, and that can actually affect the final regulation. But once that regulation goes into effect, it does have the force of law because they're essentially implementing a law. But regulations only affect those who are under the jurisdiction of the enforcing agency. So one thing to keep in mind here is just because you may not be subject to a particular regulatory guidance, it doesn't mean that your program is not going to be affected by that guidance. So for an example, today's best practices for third-party risk management are direct reflections of previous regulatory guidance for financial services. So for example, the interagency guidance on third-party relationships, that has really been considered the gold standard for TPRM for quite some time. And that brings us to rules. The rules are typically individual components of a regulation. Usually each rule is going to address a specific part of the regulation. So for example, Dodd-Frank had over 400 rules, and each individual rule can be considered a law. We also regard rules as sort of individual sets of how to comply with the overall regulation. Okay, and that brings us to guidance. Now, guidance is more or less an all-inclusive term of supplemental materials that are provided by the regulatory agency to clarify existing rules. And it's not just limited to guidance documents. It can also include things like bulletin statements, question and answer, or FAQs, advisories, etc. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that guidance is meant to be helpful, but guidance in and of itself is not binding. So as you can kind of see from their quotes, supervisory guidance does not have the force and effect of law, and the agencies do not take enforcement actions based solely on supervisory guidance. All right, so I'd like to discuss the importance of guidance just for a moment. Although it doesn't carry the full weight of the law, it does serve as a template for required activities and behaviors. So ignoring this guidance can lead examiners to scrutinize your programs more closely. So just to use a little analogy, let's think about two teenagers that are going out for the evening. The first teenager's parents ask questions about their plans and set very clear rules about being home by 11 and avoiding alcohol, drugs, and unsafe situations. That explicit guidance gives the teenager a pretty solid framework for making good choices. Now, in contrast, the second teenager's parents just simply say, "Be good," as they're walking out the door. And that vague advice really leaves it up to the teenager to interpret what it means to be good, which can lead to more risky decisions, right? So this analogy applies to guidance provided by regulators also, who outline those expectations for safe and effective operations. And of course, I know none of you are teenagers, but the principle of risk management can really vary a lot by organization. So if you're responsible for your third-party risk management program, those guidelines can serve as a vital reference for how to safely run your program. All right, now that I've brought you back down memory lane of your teenage years, let's take a break and go to our first poll. Abby?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. And this poll question is, how much do government regulations impact your organization's objectives for third-party risk management? Directly, we're a regulated industry. Indirectly, we have regulated customers who expect us to comply with the same regulations. Influence, we aren't directly regulated but follow best practices. We don't currently do third-party risk management, or you're not sure. And Hillary, it looks like we have some time to answer one of the questions that have come in from the audience so far.
Great.
And that question is, when your regulators or auditors ask for lists of vendors with risk ratings, are they usually looking for inherent risk or residual risk?
Okay, so it's really important to understand that when you are in a regulated environment and they have an expectation that you're going to risk rate your vendors, that's always going to be the inherent risk. So that raw risk that is presented by the product, service, and relationship before you think about any controls, right? So if you have the residual risk score available, you can certainly include that, but generally work on the premise that they're looking to see the inherent risk of your vendors. So make sure you have that on your inventory and that it's ready to go and request it. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. And by the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or a heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, just a reminder that in the Related Content widget, you'll find our Third-Party Risk Management Guidance and Regulations ebook. This ebook contains helpful information and tips to comply with the various third-party risk management guidelines across the globe. Be sure to check it out. Now I'll hand it back to Hillary to continue with the presentation.
So now that we understand the basics and differences between those laws, regulations, rules, and guidance, it's really important to note that sorting them all out can still be really complicated. There are thousands of laws and regulations that impact third-party risk management, regardless of whether your industry is actually regulated. Additionally, there are a ton of state and local laws that may also apply to your third-party risk management practices. So as we continue this discussion, we're going to focus more on the concepts of regulatory requirements rather than specific regulatory agencies or guidance, since there are so many of them and we wouldn't have enough time to cover each one in detail. But let's look at some examples. All right, there are so many general regulations and standards that we could share, but I'm going to stick with the ones that most people are likely to be a little familiar with. So let's start off with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It's all about improving the accuracy, reliability of corporate records and disclosures, especially when it comes to audit requirements and how companies should generally keep and store their records. Then we have the Transparency and Supply Chains Act. This one is really important because it aims to prevent human trafficking and modern slavery. We have the California Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, which is requiring certain businesses in California to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. Now moving on, we have several notable regulations and standards that address corruption and fraud, including the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, and ISO 37001, all of which seek to reduce political corruption and corporate crime. We also have workers' rights and child labor regulations, like the Wages and Fair Labor Standards Act. It's very important to make sure your vendors are complying with this one. This deals with minimum wage, overtime pay, and child labor. All right, so to continue on with that theme, we have Employee, Consumer, and General Public Safety. So again, Wages and Fair Labor Standards Act, the Equal Pay Act, and OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Those are all meant to protect safety. We have Human and Civil Rights regulations, so Title VII and the Civil Rights Act. And we also have things that are specific to protecting consumer rights, like the California Privacy Rights Act or the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. Now, these are just a few of the many examples we can share, but I wanted you to get familiar with these types of regulations that can cover a really broad range of businesses and industries. All right, so moving on to industry-specific regulations. So, of course, many industries are regulated and many industries have their own guidance. So while the basic guidelines for third-party risk management, those best practices are really an integral part of those guidance or regulations, they may have specific requirements for specific third-party risk management elements, components, or requirements. So let's look at those. All right, so let's start with financial services because they are one of the most highly regulated spaces, and there are quite a few regulators. So again, we're not looking at the individual regs here, but let's look at some of the common themes across these regulations. The first one is that the board of directors and senior management should be very engaged, that they're accountable for the execution of third-party risk management at the organization. And this is practiced pretty widely in larger banks and financial institutions. Maybe not so much in smaller ones, but it is a requirement regardless of the size of the financial service company. Now, this is to really make sure that third-party risk management is recognized as a risk for the company and that the protocols and practices that go into addressing that risk are recognized and approved by the highest levels of the company. That's why policies for third-party risk management should be approved by the board of directors or an executive committee of the board. Other similarities include that when a third party is identified to provide products or services, institutions have to take some time out and plan how they're going to manage that third party and make sure that they have resources to do that. And, you know, resources just don't include the time it takes to manage a third party, but also that the person or people doing so have the right level of expertise. Right. Another common principle across regulations is the principle of proportionality. So what that really means is that the level of risk management is scaled and proportionate to the risk posed by both the product or service and the nature of the relationship with that third party. Essentially, the greater the risk, the more robust the risk management has to be. And that's why relationships that are deemed critical or high risk always require the most comprehensive due diligence, contract structuring, monitoring, risk and performance, etc. Now, also, while I like to believe everyone understands these requirements, I need to emphasize that the process of due diligence and risk reassessment are just not one-time tasks, and they have to be regularly reviewed and evaluated. Additionally, if your financial institution has relationships with fintech companies, it's essential to include those relationships in your third-party risk management practices. Great, so let's just take a quick look at some of these regulators and their specific guidance. So the OCC, FDIC, and FRB put all their guidance together and replaced it with a single interagency guidance on third-party relationships. We have the National Credit Union Association, which has their own guidance. The FTC has the safeguards rule. The OCC also has the bank use of foreign third-party service providers. We have the SEC with the cybersecurity risk management, governance and incident disclosure guidance, and the CFPB, which has their own guidance about service providers. And of course, for those that are doing business internationally, there are plenty of global regulations. So we have the Australian CPS 230, We have the EU Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA. Probably been hearing a lot about that, cybersecurity, business continuity, et cetera. And then we have Canada's OSFI B10, which are the 6 expected outcomes for third-party risk management. All right, so let's jump over to healthcare services. So the regulatory requirements here really focus on the security and privacy of personal health information and how vendors can interact with that information and data. So the requirements here are very prescriptive and really talk about each type of relationship to the organization. Covered entities, for example, are mentioned quite a bit, and these requirements are very prescriptive when it comes to vetting third parties who have access to that data. Okay, so for organizations that are considered covered entities, any vendor that provides services to them has to meet the HIPAA requirements, and that includes providing those notifications of breach. And these business associates or these vendors have to go through pretty rigorous cybersecurity and privacy evaluations. And again, the regulator here, the core regulator, is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. All right, so let's take a look at our last category here. This is insurance services. Now, the focus of these regulatory guidelines are really about making sure that there's effective due diligence and that the organization can prove that that due diligence was executed appropriately. So you can also see that many of these different industries, they have similar themes in common, but they may have a more prevalent focus on one aspect of third-party risk management versus another. And this is why it's really important to actually identify, read, and understand the regulations that govern your industry. Okay, so while we've only touched on a few industries, there are several themes that are common and really cover a lot of these third-party risk management regulations. So some of those key themes include the protection of human and civil rights, employee and consumer safety and consumer rights. We have protecting critical infrastructures, especially considering those lessons we learned from the 2008 financial crisis. And additionally, there's a focus on safeguarding the environment and practicing effective business operations. So effective risk management, transparency, and accountable are pretty much universally essential. So when you think about these concepts, you can really apply them to basically any business practice, and you can better evaluate them against these kind of common sense ethical behavior and legal regulations. So while it is absolutely recommended and useful to know the regulations, always focusing on ethical principles is going to help you stay compliant. So remember, whenever there's a specific vendor risk, there's likely a corresponding regulation or law. Okay, so I want to just talk about privacy regulations for a moment. So as you'll see, there was the American Data Privacy and Protection Act that was supposed to be passed in 2023. Well, it was not. It was replaced by another bill called the American Privacy Rights Act, and that was introduced this year. But right now, it is still in draft form and has not been passed into law. So the new Privacy Act aims to establish kind of this comprehensive federal data privacy framework, which would replace all of the state laws that currently exist. So it seeks to really provide those consumers with rights regarding their personal data and address concerns about data brokers and online privacy practices. And those privacy laws are something to keep your eye on because as of today, 19 states already have privacy laws, and there are many more that are coming into effect over the next year or two. So if that American Privacy Rights Act passes, some of these laws may become obsolete. It's just really helpful to keep your eye on regulations, especially where you might have to meet different requirements depending on where your customer is or where you do business. So while I know we covered this just a few slides ago, I want to reiterate that there are common themes that exist across all of these laws and guidance. And it's really important to sort of get familiar with those themes because they do pop up over and over again. And most of the guidance will focus on maybe one or two or three of these themes, but having that good foundational knowledge of them is always going to be beneficial. So while it may seem that regulations are just something you have to kind of read over once, really memorizing those themes, like I've mentioned earlier, and getting to understand what they're all about is very useful. And one of the main reasons that a lot of organizations have third-party risk management is because they need to comply with those regulations. Now, in 2024, we had more than our share of examples where organizations were audited, they had that regulatory exam, and there were issues that came up, and they were very publicly informed of specific consent orders, which is, what you need to do to fix it. Some of the common themes in these exams were, poor due diligence or monitoring practices, or just a need to improve overall. All right, so the whole purpose of kind of the front half of our presentation was really to help you sort of demystify these regulations, right? We know that most of these requirements are really boiled down to a few things. They're common sense, ethical behavior, and safe and sound business practices. And when you are considering your program or processes, it's really important to just kind of ask two big questions. The first one is, does the organization meet these standards? Are we meeting these requirements as outlined by the regulation? And the next question is, does a third party meet these standards or requirements? Keep in mind that whenever you have a specific type of vendor risk, whether that's cybersecurity or business continuity, there's usually a regulation that's going to specifically address that type of risk. Okay, so let's kind of recap what we've learned so far. So first of all, regulated industries might be subject to more than one regulator, and we have to know who they are, and we have to know what that guidance says. You don't have to know the guidance by heart, but you should be able to identify those central themes and requirements of the regulation. Remember, guidance is not the law, but it is a best practice. It's that template for doing something. It's a suggested way to meet those requirements. So it's really important to read the guidance and follow it as closely as possible. Now, there's one thing to consider when it comes to guidance. If your organization can prove that you are actually meeting the requirements of the guidance or the principles of the guidance, you may be able to do things in a slightly different way. But keep in mind that any variation and evidence of meeting the requirements should always be documented, because when those examiners come in, we want to be able to demonstrate how your alternate process or practice actually meets the requirement. All right, so we've gone through an awful lot. Let's take a break for a poll question. Abby?
Our second poll question of the day is, how would you rate the effectiveness of your organization's communication regarding regulatory requirements? Excellent, good, fair, poor, or not sure? Hillary, I have another question here that I think we can go ahead and answer.
All right.
And that question is, who in the organization should be responsible for identifying all the laws and regulations that we need to follow?
Okay, so every organization should have a compliance team, or at least, one person related to compliance. And that is actually their role to make sure that all the applicable laws and regulations are identified and that they're known and followed within the organization. Now, having said that, it's always important for third-party risk management practitioners to stay on top of the regulatory environment they're in. That can mean subscribing to email alerts from your regulator or setting, a Google News search so that you can stay on top of it. Most times your compliance team is going to know exactly what's coming down the pipe, but it is really recommended that you kind of commit to being informed. Also, there may be something that comes up where they're not aware of it, and if that is the case, then you need to work with your compliance department to confirm it's something that your organization needs to comply with. I hope that helps.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I'd like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget. Here you will find our third-party risk management industry regulations library. This is a searchable library that contains regulations by industry. Hillary, back to you.
Okay, so let's think about the roles that are involved in this third-party risk management oversight. So, externally we have those regulatory examiners. They come in, they review your program, and they identify any gaps or weaknesses. They're there to just confirm that you're complying with the regulations. If you are not, they have a variety of incentives to get you to do that. So that could be everything from a consent order where you're publicly notified that you have to correct an issue, to fines, which can be quite large in some circumstances, or even a cease and desist, which actually prevents you from acquiring any new business until the issue is corrected. We also have auditors. So these are generally folks internal to the organization that are going to review and evaluate your program also to look for any gaps or inconsistencies. They're sort of like the getting ahead of the regulatory exam. They want to just make sure that we can remediate things that might pop up in the exam. And of course, their role is to inform senior leadership and the board of those issues and make sure they get closed. And of course, then we do have the board and senior leadership, and they are actually accountable for making sure that the third-party risk management program operates as it should and approving the policy and assigning all the roles and responsibilities. They're also responsible for setting that tone from the top that makes third-party risk management a priority. All right, let's take some time out to think like a regulatory examiner or an auditor. We're going to spend some time on the next two slides just because these concepts are really important and they can literally apply to any aspect of your program, any activity, task, or process. So one of the first things that an examiner might look at is for general awareness and understanding of those requirements across the organization, especially among those that are responsible for executing the tasks or activities, right? So it's always important to identify the right standards and ensure that decisions about third-party risk management are informed by those standards. And of course, awareness always starts with that tone from the top. Once the requirements are identified, we have to start thinking about their application, beginning with a defined policy that outlines the relevant scope. Are contracts enforcing these requirements, and where are they implemented? Once we think about the application of the requirements, we need to assess the adequacy of the processes and tools that we use. So it's essential to ensure that those that are responsible for these processes and tools have appropriate skills and expertise, right? That these tools are effective. Now, consistency is also vital, right? Because we need to understand that processes are aligned with the policy and executed consistently. So are any exceptions documented? Are established timelines met? So one thing about consistency, it's so important because even if you have a great process, you're not going to get great results if it's not followed consistently. So we've discussed awareness, application, adequacy, and consistency. But to prove that those elements were addressed, you always need evidence. Remember, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So examiners and auditors need proof. not just your word. The most critical piece of evidence we have is always our documented policy, along with supporting program documents and procedures. You need to have records that demonstrate the processes were followed from start to finish, including timely approvals. Having vendor documents for due diligence is also essential to show that that process is working. And effective communication documents are also key. So written confirmations such as emails from executives regarding exception approvals, for example. Accountability is always another major concern. So if there are systemic issues, auditors are going to look to identify who's ultimately responsible and accountable, potentially all the way up to the board. So clear roles and responsibilities are always necessary to have good accountability. So for example, if a business line owner fails to provide required vendor documentation, it's difficult to hold them accountable if they don't have that clarity in their role and responsibility. Now, compliance must always be monitored. If anyone internal or external is not compliant, there should be a process in place to address these issues through reporting and reviews. And effective communication of those compliance requirements is also really important. Now, lastly, examiners and auditors are going to look at oversight. They're going to evaluate whether the roles and responsibilities are clear and if proper reporting of the third-party risk management program is in place. They're also going to look for regular updates to the board to make sure that there's discussions around the program's health and stability as well as the risk across the portfolio. Additionally, it's important to have a really defined escalation process to ensure transparency and proper resolution of any issues. All right, so let's talk about how to review or self-audit your program. So there's a couple things to keep in mind here. First of all, to become a professional auditor or an examiner requires a bunch of education and experience. It's a pretty long road, but that does not mean that you cannot self-audit your own program. And as a matter of fact, conducting that kind of review is really a best practice. You know, you can do this really formally or you can do it informally. But what's important is that you do it. So a really helpful method is to break down your processes, you know, in your life cycle and focus on a specific component of that life cycle. That's going to give you the ability to really do a thorough examination of how compliant your program actually is. You know, you can choose one or more components, but it's really important to just narrow your focus at first. If you identify any issues, remember it's going to be really important to develop a formal remediation plan. And that plan always needs to include a timeline and accountability for who is on point for that remediation. We want to make sure to document everything and make sure that the steps are taken to close those gaps. Okay, so we know you love examples, so let's go through one. In this process, we're going to look at due diligence. So our due diligence process from end to end, and we're going to select a couple vendors. Now, for this, we've looked at 2 critical and 1 high-risk vendor. I always recommend looking at more than one vendor and different risk ratings, but focus on your critical and high because that is where most auditors and examiners are going to put their focus. So the first thing we do is we look at the policy. What does the policy require around due diligence? You know, who is responsible for executing these various processes to meet these requirements, and were they followed? So for example, if you have a policy requirement that says due diligence is completed and approved before we sign a contract, you look at the contracts for these 3 vendors and make sure that was done. From there, we're going to look at the processes. What processes did we have to follow? Who was responsible? Did we follow those processes consistently, right? So all the steps were completed, all the approvals were given, et cetera. And we have evidence that we did that, right? So we have any evidence that says, yes, we can track this approval from so-and-so, we have everything in our system, whatever it may be. And you also want to look if there were any exceptions and how they were handled. Now, when it comes to evidence, we're going to look at all the evidence we would need for the due diligence process. We need that inherent risk assignment. We'd need any due diligence questionnaires, the documents we collected, and the final subject matter expert reviews. We also want to look at any findings or issues that were identified and review the contract. From there, we're going to look at monitoring. How was this relationship monitored? Was there a periodic risk reassessment? Did we collect new due diligence? Was there any testing? Were there any open issues? How did the vendor perform during that period of time? Because sometimes we know that low performance should trigger additional or new due diligence, and if there's any new or emerging issues. Now, when you have that information, you've gathered all your stuff, we need to start thinking like that regulator or that auditor. So let's ask the following questions. Were the requirements known and understood? Were they applied and practiced? Is the application and practice sufficient to meet that requirement? So yes, we understood it. Yes, we followed our own requirements. Did we meet the requirement? Was that requirement followed consistently? And do we have evidence that the requirements were met? Is there an effective issue tracking and management process? Are the effective mechanisms to identify noncompliance? So when somebody's not following the process, how do we catch that before we're doing these reviews? Were roles and responsibilities clear? Were people held accountable? And is there appropriate oversight and separation of duties? And when it comes to separation of duties, it's really important to understand that, for example, the first line business vendor owner would not be approving the due diligence risk control review, for example, right? We need to make sure that there's clear separation of duties. All right, it's also really important to remember that it's completely normal to find gaps or inconsistencies, even when you thought that your process was running perfectly well. So once you do identify an issue, there's some leading causes for that. One of them is that there was not consistent execution, or the documentation is disorganized, or there's maybe not enough of it. Another issue is that the policy might be out of touch with what the real process is. That can be a really big problem when policies are written to be aspirational as opposed to reflecting the current state. And finally, when responsibilities are not executed by the appropriate person or not at all, that's another big finding that we commonly see in audits or exams. Okay, so even if you've been reviewing your program kind of informally, if you come across an issue, it is recommended that you document it. Figure out the root cause of why the process failed, what the gap is, and start building a remediation plan, because you need to get it back on track. Once you have your plan and your findings, make sure to take them to the appropriate stakeholders, whether that's your management, risk management committee, or even the business owner in the first line, because we need to make sure that this issue gets closed. So another thing to consider here is you're not going to find any issues if you don't look, but ignorance is not always bliss, especially if the examiner finds the problem before you do. That's why it's really important to document those gaps and start executing the remediation plan and keeping track of your progress until it's closed. Because if an examiner or an auditor should, find out that you knew there was a big issue, but you didn't really do anything about it, it's going to become an even bigger problem. So auditors and examiners always really expect that your organization is going to self-monitor to a degree, and that you take risk management seriously. So going through these activities, making the right documentation and remediation plan really shows that commitment to risk management. Okay, so I think we are ready for our last poll question of the day. Abby?
And our third and final poll question of the day is, what is the primary method your organization uses to train employees on regulatory compliance related to third-party risk management? In-person training sessions of workshops or seminars? Online training? On-the-job training? We have no formal training. or you're not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
Great.
And that question is, if we are regulated by the OCC, does that mean our vendors are also regulated and subject to regulatory exams?
Okay, so it is important to understand that your vendors are not directly regulated by the OCC, but they can ask your bank to conduct specific audits and allow your regulators to see the results of those audits. So that's why it's really important to make sure that your third-party risk management program is following all the regulatory requirements, that you know the guidance really well, and that you're holding your vendors accountable to those same standards. So no, the OCC does not have the jurisdiction to go to your vendor and audit them directly, but they do have the power to make you do it and share the results. I hope that's helpful.
And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question, as it's interesting to see what everyone says. Before we continue, I would like to remind everyone that we have our Vendor Cybersecurity and Privacy Compliance, Key Regulations and Tips to Know infographic available for download in the related content widget. Be sure to grab this handy resource that discusses maintaining regulatory compliance with regard to cybersecurity and state privacy laws. Let's continue with the presentation. Hillary, back to you.
Okay, so yes, the day will come that you get that notice of an audit or regulatory exam. And the first thing to do is not panic, right? These are normal parts of a healthy process. And if you've been auditing your program and you found a few issues, please don't try and scramble to get them all fixed right now, right? If you've already been capturing the issues and you have remediation plans in place, you can submit them with your audit documentation. But trying to get everything fixed before they walk in the door, that is not usually possible or practical. So the truth is, and we have to remember, that auditors and examiners always expect to find a few issues, and they know that we all have problem vendors. The best case scenario is that, the issues or findings are just more observations or suggestions for improvement. Even if you think you have a perfect program, you always need to expect some findings or observations at the bare minimum. All right, time to wrap up with some key takeaways for today. So I hope that everyone's going to walk away from today's session really understanding, what it is that your auditors and regulators expect. And that's basically, processes and behavior that reflect good common sense. It's really important to take the time to identify and read the regulations and the guidance and stay on top of them. You can do that by subscribing directly to a regulator's news feed on their website or set up kind of a Google News alert. We want to make sure that we're consistently reviewing our third-party risk management program with that auditor or examiner mindset and really ask those good questions about awareness and application, adequacy, consistency, evidence, accountability, compliance, and oversight. If you do find an issue, document it and put together a plan to treat it. But remember, that plan is only as good as its execution, so you have to be diligent about making sure the issues are remediated. Train everybody to treat, adequacy, consistency, and evidence as daily priorities. Always take the mindset that the regulator or the auditor is coming the next day. If you do get scheduled for that audit or exam, go ahead and prepare for it. Make sure you're organized, but know that when you take time out to follow your processes, manage documentation and evidence every day, that preparation is going to become that much easier for you. Remember that even the best programs have findings in those audit exams, even if they're just suggestions for improvement. So always expect something to come out of any formal audit or exam. And no matter what, always be transparent and cooperative with your examiners. Don't try to hide the ugly spots. Auditors and examiners are trained to find them. So I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I think it is time to turn back over to Abby for Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I want to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time and for sharing some really important information. And on your screen now, you will see an upcoming session on December 18th, the Managing Third-Party AI Risk, What You Need to Know Today webinar. If interested, a link to register for that session is in your copy of today's presentation slides. And let's go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during the session. Okay, Hillary, the next question I have here is, what if a high-risk vendor, like a shredding company, is a very small business? Asking for the same due diligence as a core provider is nearly impossible.
Okay, so a couple things here. One, all of the regulatory agencies and guidance recognize that all vendors aren't the same. And the important part to keep in mind is they want to make sure that you have done the work as an organization to effectively suss out if the risks that are present with that business relationship and or that product or service can be sufficiently controlled by, your internal controls and risk management practices or those of the vendors, and that you've been able to make an educated decision. There are certainly times when we can't get a ton of due diligence, and they're not saying that you have to have a certain amount. They just want you to be able to prove that you actually did the work to make an educated decision. I hope that helps.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Next question here is there an alert system with OSFI? For example, where can I subscribe for alerts on new regulations that might come up?
Okay, so this is a great question, and not just for OSFI, which is Canada's financial regulator, but pretty much for almost every regulator out there. If you go directly to their website, you can just, Google search it up. Almost all of them have a section. Usually it's in the contact us or about us sections of the website where you can subscribe to email alerts. And I totally recommend doing that because they'll alert you of changes coming way in advance. If anything if anything's been updated, or sometimes they actually take away certain regulations and replace them completely with something else. So I recommend everybody get to the regulator website and sign up for those email updates.
Great. Next question. What kind of training should we provide to our employees regarding TPRM compliance?
Okay, so most of you, if you're in a regulated industry, have a lot of compliance training anyway, right? Your cybersecurity or fraud, waste, and abuse, whatever it may be, everybody has to sit through those trainings. And those are really important, but they're not the same as third-party risk management compliance. And what I generally recommend for organizations is to develop or, outsource someone to develop some standardized training that all vendor owners and, relevant stakeholders can take to kind of outline the expectations, what is sort of mission critical to their role, how issues and exceptions are handled, how oversight is managed. And it really depends on your organization. Some people go very deep into this, but at the bare minimum, usually, some kind of online training you can set out or do training sessions, whatever, to go through those basic minimums, like what is not allowed. Like, for example, we do not sign contracts until due diligence has been completed. Or another example is all vendors have to be subject to some level of scrutiny and vetting before we do business with them. So it's really up to your organization, but I do recommend having something that specifically addresses not only the third-party risk management regulations that you're trying to follow, but what your internal requirement expectations are. I hope that answers that question.
Perfect. Next question here. Do we have to proactively provide anything to regulators? Is there mandated reporting for TPRM practices?
Your regulators in particular are going to be pretty specific about what they're looking for. In almost every regulatory exam I have been under, they have a line item that says any relevant reporting or reporting that demonstrates XYZ. But it's always a good idea to make sure that you, at a bare minimum, have that full vendor inventory with risk ratings and contract dates. It's important that you can show that you've been communicating any issues or the risk of the program, the health and stability of the program, kind of your risk exposure to the board or senior management or the risk committee. Other than that, they will ask you pretty specifically for reporting for the item that they're looking for. Hope that's helpful.
Great. Next question. Is GDPR considered a TPRM regulation?
Yes, it will. It's the General Data Protection Act, and it is from, it's an overseas regulation. Why this is important is because when we're dealing with vendors who can access, transmit, process, or store data, or if we're doing business in that region, if we have customers in that region, then the rules of that regulation apply. So while it's not directly a third-party risk management relationship, to a regulation, it does apply. So I hope that helps.
Great. Next question. I work for a bank that is regulated by both the OCC and the SEC. Does one set of guidance supersede the other?
No, they don't. Again, as we discussed earlier, a lot of guidance has similar themes, but specific to financial institutions that have a relationship with both regulators, you do have to make sure you understand the differences of what they are requiring, making sure you can meet the requirements of both sets of regulation. It's really, really important because the SEC has a slightly different spin on things, and it really is a lot about that data protection. For example, like a breach notification, if there's a data breach, they're going to feel similar, but please make sure that you review both sets of guidance and follow them.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. So thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions that we did not have time to answer today, we will address with you offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary as well for her time and great content. And ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and is free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the questions and conversations must. So go post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. Within the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to third-party risk management regulations to assist you. If you'd like to become a member of the third-party think tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also within that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request your CPE credit. On behalf of Venminder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.